in listen-only mode.
Hey there, welcome to February 3TC. We are glad to be together with you. Hopefully you grabbed your coffee. I want to say thanks to Trinity Lutheran College for helping to sponsor Third Tuesday Conversations. My name is Danica, and I will be your host. Today we have Dr. Andy Root with us from Luther Seminary, talking theology to youth ministry. And his newest series of books. Series, is that what you'd call them, Andy?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, great. Well, Andy, we're excited to have you with us today. We're hoping, as always, that this is a conversation over coffee. So if you've got any questions or comments for Andy as we go along this conversation, please type your questions into the right-hand side of the box, and I'll pass them along to him here. Welcome, Andy. We're glad to have you. And this is you're our first repeat guest on 3TC, so we're excited to have you back with us again. How have you been?
Thanks. I've been doing pretty good. Yeah, it's really, really cold, as you know, Danica. You're over in the other side of the cities. It's really super cold here in the Twin Cities today, so I'm just trying to survive that.
It is really cold. Awesome. Well, why don't you just start off by telling us about this latest series? We had the Taking Theology to Youth Ministry as the title, so we'll probably stay a bit in that book, but maybe tell us a little bit about the process, why you picked what you picked for the topics of your 4 books, what you've been learning, all those kinds of things. Why don't you just give us sort of an overview about what we've got here?
Yeah, well, the 4 books you see before you right now, they're really, really weird and really, really trippy. And so I think they worked out pretty well, but they are really kind of weird books. So basically what I've tried to do in these books is, for lack of a better term, and to not make you want to kind of gag over your coffee right now, I tried to kind of write a pseudo kind of systematic theology about youth ministry, and so you're already thinking, wow, I will never read these books ever. And so to try to make them readable, I made them short. They're very kind of short books, 110, 120 pages. But I also kind of constructed this fictional character named Nadia, and I named her Nadia because I thought it was really cute to start each book with a chapter called The Chronicles of Nadia. You get it? Get it? You get it? Yeah.
Get it.
So yeah, it was the height of creativity. But so basically wanting to...
Oh, that's not saying much, Andy.
Yeah. Wanting to take this person Nadia, and as a kind of fictional character, but as I think someone who the reader will really connect with, especially if you've done any full-time or part-time or volunteer youth ministry. And so she kind of has a theological awakening in each book, or at least a theological conundrum that she kind of has to deal with. So in the first book, she kind of has started this job, and she has to kind of figure out what's the purpose of youth ministry, what's real youth ministry for, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute here. But then in the second book, she gets invited to kind of give a talk at a big kind of camp, and she's asked to talk about the cross, so she's got to kind of think about what is the cross. And other things happen within her ministry that lead her to have to ask big questions. And the same goes for Scripture, as well as kind of mission and eschatology, which is really a book that looks at mission trips and things like that. So I've kind of tried to take these kind of concrete, practical experiences that all of us have on the ground in ministry and try to connect them to deeper theological ideas. So, you know, these books kind of follow on the heels of the book Kenneth Creasy Dean and I wrote called The Theological Turn in Youth Ministry, which was trying to make a pretty significant pitch that we've experienced a lot of youth workers out there, and hopefully a lot that are listening in right now, who really want to take a theological turn, are kind of sick of just being people who are, their job is to get kind of fickle, uninterested people interested in the church. Like you're either the HR department for the church and you're trying to fill empty Lutheran pews with Lutheran butts, or your job is to kind of keep kids good and moral and try to think more deeply about how God acts and how God moves within the context of our ministries, and like who young people are in light of who God is, and so forth. So these books kind of follow on the heels of this argument of the theological turn and try to even give more flesh and more connections and more handles in this series. So I think they're very readable books, but they are kind of strange books in the sense that they're written through this fictional character, but then they open up. They're not just novels. I'm not nearly that talented to write just kind of novel pieces like that. But we use this fictional character to set a context and then kind of spin in to deeper theological ideas, and to do so kind of in bite-sized chunks. So I kind of actually say that the way I imagine these books are kind of like power bars, or energy bars, where it's not a full meal, but it's enough. It's hopefully it's a substantive, substantial enough meal or snack that kind of gives you energy to continue to think deeply about your ministry. So those are the larger hopes of the project.
Cool. And had this, what the basis of, this character sort of doing a case, not really a case study, but
yeah, sort of though, yeah.
From a particular perspective of one person. Did that come out of conversation that you had over the last several books that you've written, or with your work at the seminary, or, I think it's an interesting lens to look at these sorts of things. In what am I trying to say? It's a different lens than obviously your other books.
Mm-hmm.
Were you hoping to reach a different audience, or just tell a little bit more about why you chose that format? You said a little bit about the bite-sized pieces, but
yeah,
the format is interesting.
Yeah, I think the reason for the format is, one, trying to really make a case to a broader audience that these larger theological ideas, or really questions about the way God acts and moves within our context, how that can be really significant for our ministry. So I felt like it was readable, but I also have a really strong commitment that gets played out in this book, Taking Theology to Youth Ministry, towards the end of it, that I really do think theology happens on the ground, in local places, up against local questions. And I particularly remain very committed to youth ministry, because I think youth ministry is a really unique place where we can talk deep theological ideas, that young people aren't socialized out of asking significant questions about mystery and transcendence and things like that. So that becomes a really significant thing, and as well as the fact that we kind of do have this sense where we want to pass on our faith to our young people. We want them to have an experience of God, where sometimes in larger adult frames of ministry, we think we've somehow intellectualized ourselves out of that. And so I think youth ministry is a particularly interesting place to talk about concrete, lived experiences that have incredible theological resonance to them. And so that was one of the reasons for the format, I think, was to kind of push us in that direction, and try to offer something to youth ministry that looks at like doctrinal issues like eschatology and scripture and things like that, and unpacks those in a way that they matter. And I guess in some sense I'm trying to take my seminary students who are long out of this place, like you, Danica, and hopefully write something in a way that keeps them wanting to be engaged in larger, broader conversations. Where the experiences themselves come from that I give to this young woman actually do kind of come from talking to students for the last 8 years about their ministry experience, and come from my own experiences and kind of drawing those out. Like for instance, in the Taking Unpacking Scripture and Youth Ministry book, it all starts when Nadia forgets to latch this kind of side door to her church, and the church gets broken into, and then this, ironically, just like happens in the church, this weird incident leads into someone questioning her view of the Bible, and just because she didn't lock this door, because they're accusing her of like the Bible study getting in, and then a woman in the church says, well, we're actually very nervous about what you think of the Bible anyhow. What are you teaching these kids? So she has to actually lead into this conversation. Well, the experience of leaving a door open and having the church get broken into actually was an experience I had when I was a youth worker. That I got a call one Saturday morning, and they said, yeah, our security system alarm went off, and a cop had to come, and you forgot to lock the door, and it led into all sorts of church politic issues. So it's taking those experiences from students, from myself, and trying to kind of weave them into one person's experience, but all for the purpose of really unpacking the theological depth within them.
Yeah. I think the question for me comes up, and always I think in any sort of conversation like this, is what I think is particularly cool about having it from this lens is that as a youth worker, so often, at least in my context, you have to um, un help people unlearn what they think they know about youth ministry, and that it's just about playing games in the basement. And that, at least in my congregation, youth ministry is leading the way in helping the whole congregation to think about what it means to participate in God's activity. And that it is more than, playing apples to apples, or things like that. That what would you say from where you sit is the role of these books in helping practitioners, such youth workers and pastors, to help congregations to think this way?
Yeah. Yeah, well, and that's really the big move of the first book, which is, I mean, the book really is about what's the purpose of youth ministry. Like, what's the point of this? Here we have, 50 people or so listening in on this, and what's the point of what you do? And I mean, my read on that, how you would answer the question, the purpose of youth ministry is for question mark, like how do you go about answering that question, is I do think that we kind of find ourselves in, to say it probably politely, in a cul-de-sac, and maybe to say it hyperbolically, that we're kind of imprisoned by how we answer that question. And I think historically how we've answered this question, and again I unpacked this I think in chapter 2 or 3 of the book or something, that that we usually answer what youth ministry is for. I mean, it depends on where we sit within the church. We sit within kind of a conservative Protestant congregation. Usually youth ministry has existed kind of for keeping kids good. Like the point of it is that we are going to have a youth program that helps kids be good kids and understand who Jesus is so they'll be good kids. And so you can see how that starts to play out in how you practice your ministry really quickly. Like, parents send their kids here so that their kids become good kids and that they're safe. And so your job is to kind of uphold some certain morals or values, or make sure kids are wearing their seatbelts and not having sex and not doing drugs. And you can kind of evaluate the good of the ministry as well as the good of your own work as a youth worker by how much kids are correlating to these kind of moral ideals. And I think that is the truth of the kind of history of youth ministry, that congregational-based youth ministry, particularly when youth ministry kind of went localized within individual congregations from a broader kind of denominational level, it really was energized and funded because people were really worried about their kids, especially against the backdrop of a counterculture that just kind of felt like, man, our kids do not understand biblical faith, our kids do not have a commitment to it. We need a youth worker who can make a case for them coming to church and seeing Jesus as important, which is why the stereotype continues that the good youth worker is kind of the young, good-looking, the stereotype goes male, athletic kind of person, because your whole point isn't to be a deep, reflective person. That's not why you got hired in the first place. The point is you look youthful, you look cool enough that you can make a case for the conservative Protestant kind of cultural commitments, really, that that the church desires for you. But you can start to see that becomes quite an ugly ditch to kind of fall into. And that really started in the 1970s and moved kind of really strongly into the 80s. Mainline congregations, which are probably where most of us who are listening to this kind of live and reside, they didn't really jump on the youth ministry bandwagon until the mid to late 80s, and they really did it because mainline decline had deeply sunk into our institutions, and it became really clear that if we didn't do something and do something quickly, we're going to have empty Methodist, empty Lutheran, empty Presbyterian churches, and we didn't want that. So the best way to kind of repopulate the church with committed members was actually to do youth ministry. I mean, youth ministry would be the way that would usher them in from adolescent angst into, membership in Methodist or Lutheran churches. Well, I mean, that some of us may feel like that's more noble, maybe not. But you can see that becomes an ugly ditch too, where youth ministry really exists for making more Lutherans. Like, that's your point. That's the whole point of this thing. And we could get into some more cynical reads of how that plays itself out within the ELCA and beyond. But I want to try to redefine, in the context of this book, and then leading into the next 3 books, is to try to imagine, through this personatia, what if we answered this question differently? What if we answered that the purpose of youth ministry was actually to participate in the action of God? How might that change? And how do we move that from kind of just light or nice phraseological, theological language to actually something concrete and real. Hence, again, the reason to give this person a kind of real life Nadia, so that we can actually see her wrestle with trying to actually do youth ministry from the answer that youth ministry is for participating in the action of God, and how that changes the way she views Scripture, how that changes the way she views mission trips, how that changes the way she even views the way the cross of Christ functions, and the way she even understands who young people are throughout these books. So that's really the kind of push here, is to kind of push it into thinking about ministry as participating in the action of God. And I think in a significant way, this does have impact within the whole congregation, that that youth ministry is no different than the rest of contexts of ministry, other than its contextual place. And you, Danica, may not remember this, and Elizabeth, who's sitting in the room with you, might not remember either, but I often tell my own students that youth ministry really doesn't exist. I mean, it's not really a thing. It's surely not a biblical or theological concept. Youth ministry is ministry, and it should have a commonality with all other forms of ministry. It's distinctive and will continue to exist for a long time because we have a culturally deterministic group, a cohort of people we call adolescents, who are marketed to, who could be put in secondary education, who apply to go to universities or don't. I mean, these are cultural realities that make youth ministry exist. But really, before 1950, and really for sure at the beginning of the 19th century, there really wasn't a thing called youth ministry. I mean, maybe there was still a thing called confirmation, but it was really a right into adulthood, and not kind of this catechizing zone where you learned some stuff and then went into the high school youth group.
Yeah. Well, I've got a bunch of questions coming in, so I want to make sure to continue to invite people to keep asking their questions. I think let's just jump right into them. I'm sorry if I mispronounced this name. Broad asks, the problems and changes around and in youth ministry change from time to time. Do you think we have one theology or many theologies which change when things change around the life of a youth?
Yeah, that's a good question. So do we have kind of many theologies or kind of one theology? It's a good question. I mean, I'm starting to work on this book I'm writing that I'm contractually to Bonhoeffer, and Bonhoeffer's work with young people. And one of the interesting things Bonhoeffer says in one of his lectures into the ecumenical movement in the early 1930s is he tries to really actually make quite a strong case that there's no such thing as a youth theology, and that we shouldn't be trying to do theology as a youth theology. And I actually kind of, in some ways, agree deeply with him in the sense that I think there's a commonality to all of theology, but the commonality that makes it, I think, a little bit more elastic than just saying, well, there's one true theology, and the point is just to assimilate to this true theology, is to say that we always experience, I think, it's always in and through our experience that we participate in the very action of God. So one of the things that I think is core to our theology is this desire to participate in the unveiling of God in the world. But God unveils God's self in the world, or we see the unveiling of God in the world in different ways at different times for different contextual reasons. So I'm not necessarily trying in these books kind of to make a youth theology necessarily, but to say that there are certain theological commitments that come to mind or come into view because of the practice of youth ministry itself. So I mean, in some ways, I would kind of, as I understand the question, be kind of the middle ground between it, in the sense of saying, I think what theology ultimately is reflection on God's action, on what God is doing. But as human beings who are kind of bound in our own thought systems and our own cultural realities, we come to articulate that experience different in different contexts and in different places. But yet the object of theological reflection remains always the same, which is God's unveiling or God's making of God's self known, and the witness to that. I don't know. Maybe that's a little bit too obscurely theological answer, but it's a really good question.
Great. Kristen is wondering, could these books be used with an adult discussion forum, or do they make the most sense to those who are in youth ministry profession?
Yeah, I mean, they're definitely written for kind of youth ministry professionals, but I do think that they would, that they would, I hope this doesn't sound arrogant. I mean, I think that they would read well beyond that, and it would be interesting to me to get feedback on how they work. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
obviously the main character of the book is a youth worker, but I do think that the universe I've put her in is big enough where she's interacting with her associate pastor and her senior pastor and parents and others that I do think it could work as an interesting discussion. And actually, at the end of each book, there are discussion questions that were um, written by Jess Dom, and they're really good questions, and yeah, would be a good resource in that sense. So
Awesome.
try it out and let me know, I guess is what I would say. Yeah.
Cool. Clay is wondering, will there be more books with other topics?
I don't know. You have to ask Sandra, but I hope so. I mean, I end this in a very, I don't know. It ends like the end of the last book, Unlocking Mission in Eschatology and Youth Ministry. I ended in this kind of very dirty, like comic book magazine or comic book movie kind of way. You know, like there could be a sequel if you people buy enough tickets. You know, like this very kind of gross kind of thing. But essentially, the book ends with not a student in Nadia's ministry, a young person in Nadia's ministry, I should say, knocking on the door and basically saying, "Hey, I just was at this church with my friend, and they said that that you needed to be baptized in the Holy Spirit to be a true believer. Have I been baptized in the Holy Spirit?"
Mm-hmm.
And so it kind of ends with that like
Dun,
that
dun,
cliffhanger
dun.
that if there is another book, yeah, right, like exactly, like will people, yeah. So if there is a next book, it would be on pneumatology and on the Spirit. Imagine writing one on pneumatology, writing one on ecclesiology, and maybe even one on the Trinity, all again in this same kind of format. So maybe, I mean, I'm thinking about pitching them. They've been well received so far, but who knows? So I hope, I
Cool.
think, maybe.
Great.
So thanks.
Rebecca is wondering, are these best used in a particular order?
Oh, should they be used in a particular order?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they're written in a particular. This was a big. I mean, this is like the actor studio on how hot dogs are made. Did they do an episode of the actor studio on hot dogs are made? That remind me.
I don't
Mixing
know.
metaphors here, or is that just? Um, so this is the behind the scenes. I think I'm metaphors. So this is like the behind the scenes. We had a long conversation. These should be numbered, like if it should be part 1, part 3, part 4, not want to number them because they had some kind of marketing data that numbered books don't do well, are
Mm-hmm.
written in an order. So they're taking Theology to Youth Ministries first, then taking the cross, then unpacking Scripture, and then unlocking mission. Now they don't have to be read in order. I think that you would be fopping in the middle, but they were written in that way, and
Okay.
Naughty kind of unfolds in that way. And throughout the other kind of a review, kind of summarizing. So I think you'd be fine, say, with unpacking Scripture, but they were written in that way.
Cool. All right. Paul has a question. He says it's not a new question, but it would be intriguing to hear what Andy thinks about how do we successfully advocate for churches to look past that youthful, cool motif of a youth worker. You talked or alluded to that before.
Oh, how to?
So how do you advocate for churches to look past the
Yeah.
clown with big shoes and plays the guitar?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And as we live kind of is of the way we kind of function in the world and the way we see things. People actually function that. I remember when I was doing Southern California, I was like the junior high out pastor, and we were in junior high, and I really pushed hard as kids from context and difficult economic that we really should consider somebody in this way, and that we really should make sure that we get someone who understands context and even the racial dynamics, Latino and Armenian kids. I mean, we should really think about that. It's incredibly hard to get to neighborhood to be on the search in your high youth pastor. And got them to the meeting. Adults that were running the search asked the two kids what they thought. Like, what do you think we need in the new user? And this kid, like this kind of hardened kid who was living in this neighborhood and was in a gang or close to being, but had been part of our ministry for 6 months. Search community is like, well, I think we need someone who can are. Can you make sure that you are? And I just wanted to just strangle the kid because but he was living into this kind of framework and this model that he thought a pastor should look like. He should be, a white guy with a soul patch under his and plays the guitar, kind of hipster ethos. And he just lived into that very script. So, I mean, it's a really good question on how do we kind of keep that open. And this maybe sounds like it just kind of perpetuates what I'm interested in my own perspective. I really think you can only kind of break that open when you ask people to imagine the ministry and actually ask significant questions about the purpose of this ministry. And if the ministry is to participate in the action of God, the 23-year-old guy is the person who should be hired because of the way he can imagine or helps the young people imagine participation in the action of God. But maybe that's not the person. Maybe it's actually the person closer to retirement age that is actually the person we should call it. I tend to be someone who really thinks deeply that the point youth ministry person not to do the youth ministry starts to change the who is the person who's called to do the job of the paid youth ministry actually to be someone or ordaining other ministry to young people. Yeah. They mature enough and has a pastoral spirit, people in the congregation to. I don't think the paid youth worker's job is. I think your job is to advocate for the youth ministry and to model how one does actually doing ministry with kids. Ultimately, your job is to ordain others into the ministry of caring for young people and participating in the act of these young people. But that means you need imaginative and have a 22-year-old person who looks with conversations with actually is the purpose of youth ministry. If it's for just repopulating the church, or if it's for really keeping our kids good, and then you can see how kind of influence becomes the driving metaphor for this, which connects to some of my previous work. That leads us into, I think, certain corners that are ultimately not very helpful.
Awesome. I have a couple more questions, Andy, but we have run to the end of our slotted time. I know you said you'd be able to stick around 10 more minutes. Are you still cool with that?
You can stay for 10 or 12 more minutes. It'll be fine.
Perfect. Yeah. Let me do some housekeeping stuff quick, and then we'll jump back into those questions. All right. PracticeDiscipleship.org. Then you can see the upcoming webinars coming up. January 20th, tomorrow. Oh, no, January is gone. Just kidding. March 3rd is our next one. And you can find that on PracticeDiscipleship.org. If you haven't already downloaded the network app, it's available at the App Store and at the Android Marketplace. It's a cool resource. Check that out. And next month, we are going to have Carrie Lynn Wampler talking talking with us. She's a family therapist, and so we'll look forward to that. Thanks for joining us. If you have to go, we certainly understand that. And if you can stick around just a few more minutes, that'd be great. Go back to Andy, your mug shot here. It sounds like I'm breaking up a little bit. Sorry about that. Michelle is wondering, would these books be a way of getting at the shift of thinking about youth ministry? And she's wondering in the context of volunteers shifting their thinking. I think we talked a little bit about that with other adults, but you think volunteers could wrap their head around this, Andy?
Oh, yeah, I'm getting a little bit of internet feedback, Danica, so I'll answer what I think you asked, like a good politician. You only answer the question you want to answer. But yeah, I think I think these would work well with volunteers. Actually, I think it would be an interesting I think it would be readable to them. So I would recommend it in that way. I mean, it does open up to them questions, especially the first book, opens up questions about like what are parents interested in, why are parents anxious about this, and how larger pastoral look at the youth ministry. I mean, I think it worked fairly well, and you can let me know if it does, if you use it, and if you did. But yeah, I think that they would work.
Cool. Jonathan says, do these books address some of the changes you're seeing in how faith formation happens with youth today? And maybe that's another topic, he says. But with some of, the whole conversation of being missional and whatever, I think that's probably what Jonathan is wondering.
Yeah, yeah, they do, especially the second book, the Taking the Cross to Youth Ministry. I really try to pick that up, and especially at the end of the book, and try to ask the question. I mean, what is disciple like? What is discipleship? I mean, if we really are focusing on youth ministry as participating in the action of God, then what is faith? What actually is faith in conversation with this theological commitment? And I do try to actually, throughout all the books, make a heavy-handed critique against the way we tend to understand as this kind of assimilation into either religious knowledge or religious institutional. And I worry about that. I think, especially in part of it I found in certain anthropology. We have a way we define what a young person is, and we tend to define young people through culturally given categories of adolescence and tend to as people who are growing, advancing, and preparing. I mean, the point of adolescence is that you grow bodily, you grow intellectually, that you advance, that you move from one grade to the next and eventually apply for college, so that you grow, you advance, and that you're preparing. I mean, the whole point is not that you are an adult now, or not that you're no longer a child, but you're not really an adult because you're in a preparatory stage where you're trying to become what you're going to be in the future. Mm-hmm. And I actually think that we as a church have kind of co-opted that definition of young people, and it leads to certain problems, and it leads us into actually seeing faith formation as for advancement, preparation, or growth. Or as young people are growing, advancing, and preparing, the point of the church is to give a religious add-on to that escalator ride towards kind of adult power and adult strength. And so it actually, I think, ironically minimizes the importance of the Christian commitment as an articulation of the way God acts and moves, and makes religion makes faith really religion that kind of gives value added as young people grow, advance, and prepare. And what I'm trying to actually argue for, especially in that second book, Through the Cross, is that we should probably define young people. I think it's a more theologically legitimate, maybe even a more social scientifically legitimate way to define young people, not as those who are advancing, growing, and preparing, but those who are becoming aware of what's true for all of us, that we're always stuck between possibility and nothingness. And adolescence is this radical time where you realize you're caught between possibility and nothingness, that we tell young people all the time, like, you can do whatever you want with your life. Mm-hmm. Your whole life is before you. There's nothing but possibility before you. But while they're told that, at the same day, sometimes the same hour, sometimes the same minute, they're saying you can do whatever you want with your life, but you can never play varsity soccer.
Yep.
You're not good enough. Or you can be whatever you be, but she will date you, man. You know what I mean? So you're always kind of bound between these possibilities and nothingness. And I think actually if we take that kind of anthropology, what it means to be stuck between possibility and nothingness, it allows us much richer ways to talk about who God is and how God acts. That God is the one, through the cross, who takes on nothingness for the sake of an all-new possibility. So faith formation and how we even think about faith has to be embedded within that larger theological currency, that the larger theological perspective that God moves from nothingness into new possibility, or God finds us in the struggle between possibility and nothingness. So adolescence becomes this unique time where you become conscious of this reality. In faith formation, or the movement of faith, faith is trusting in God's act up against your experiences of nothingness, or up against your deep questions. And when we view faith formation as a time of advancement, preparation, and growth, then it really is, don't deal with hard questions. I mean, don't ask the really scary questions, because that could upend young people's advancement and growth. I mean, they could decide to advance and growth in another area. But if we view young people as bound between possibility and nothingness, and a God who enters into the world in and through possibility and nothingness, then faith becomes something different. Faith is actually trusting in God's act up against your deepest, darkest questions. And so I do think that there's ways it changes faith formation. And I was writing these books for Zondervan, who was a classically classically evangelical publisher. And so I was trying to push that conversation there too, of trying to move away from putting adjectives in front of faith, because this is what we tend to do. I mean, it's not good enough just that kids have faith. We want them to have, deep faith, or enriched faith, or really, 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 really important faith or something. And I think when we put adjectives in front of it, it just shows us that we're actually in articulation more with human action and what human beings need to do than actually with God's action. That faith is always up against impossibility, and faith is always, as some theologians say, becoming. It's always something that we're leaning into. It's not anything that we ever accomplish, because it's directed towards God's very act, which comes to us always in hidden and yet revealed ways.
I'm glad you said something about that accomplished thing. I think so often in youth ministry, people view it as, are you accomplishing something? Are there more kids showing up? Are there more, that adjective? I think that's a perfect way, and you touch on that in the first book about it's about accomplishing something rather than, I think you say, like, also being a yearner, that you as a youth worker also yearn for God's presence and God's action alongside the kids. Okay, we'll take two more questions, and I know you got to get going. But Eric just wrote in, how do we begin to teach this and live this out in a place that has no desire to think theologically? Good question, Eric.
Yeah, well, it's a great question, and I always hesitate to answer such questions because I just don't know your context, and so what I could say could either be trite or misguided or not address the depth of what you're saying. But what I'll risk in answering, how I'll risk answering is like this: is that I actually do think people desire to think theologically. I think now it's true that some people may not, but the only way to ignite people into desiring to think theologically is not to shake them until they think theologically. It is actually for us, especially those of us in leadership, to lean into our own theological identity. That I think theology is actually caught more than it's taught, in the sense that when we live this thing out, when we are the ones who are reflecting deeply and asking deep questions, then I think that it has the potential. And again, I don't know your congregation, your context, so I hesitate to be completely bold and upfront about this. But I think the more that we can lean into and think theologically, the more we can ignite this. And I also think, this is what I'm trying to do in this Nadia books, is that theology starts with the questions that are embedded within us and within the people we work with. And I think theology starts, and this is how it starts for Nadia, is by fronting these questions that we all are wrestling with. And so I think we can get intimidated from thinking theologically when we think the point is to have answers for this. I don't think the best theological thinkers actually dwell or deliver answers. I think they're able to pose questions that connect to people at a kind of deep emotive as well as existential level, and I think that's how we start this. So for the young people that I've worked with before, it's always often through certain forms of popular art or popular culture that we start to raise these questions, and then can start leaning in to the mysteries of how one answers these questions, and then bring the Christian tradition to bear upon them in the midst of that. So I guess that's how I would start to answer it, but it is a really difficult question, I think.
Cool. Andy, we are out of town. I want time, not out of town. We're out of time, and I want to honor that.
It's so cold. I wish I was out of town.
Me too. There's a couple more questions here, and would you be okay if people emailed you their questions from today's?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. They can find all your information on your website. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Andy.
AndrewRoot.org is probably the place to go. That would be cool.
Great. And just a quick, where do you want to point people to purchase your books?
Yeah, I mean, you can find them on Amazon, or you could, you'll find them on the writing section of that website that I just mentioned, AndrewRoot.org as well. So that would be great. Or yeah, Amazon is a great place to go. So they're there.
Awesome. Hey, Andy, thanks so much for being with us this afternoon. And hopefully you'll get feedback from the fun questions that, volunteers and parents and all those kinds of things. Hopefully you'll get some great feedback from those who are listening here today that might try it with new audiences. So, again, thanks for taking time out of your day to chat with us, and thanks for your contribution in these latest books to the youth ministry world. So. We hope you have a great day, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, and thanks for everyone who listened, and yeah, it was fun. Thanks, Danica.
Awesome. Bye-bye.